One of the privileges of my life as a young man was to be in the Boy Scouts. The Boy Scouts of the United States has a motto, be prepared. The idea is to think ahead, be prepared for eventualities, and I found that a very helpful motto for me that I've tried to follow over the years. If you knew a hurricane was coming, how would you be prepared? In 2017, Hurricane Irma was on its way to the United States. And the cry came over and over again from the leadership in the state of Florida, be prepared, Irma's coming. Prepare, Irma's coming. Over and over they talked about how the path of Irma would go right on up Florida. And indeed, it was quite a devastating hurricane. And those who were not prepared saw their cars sunk. Those who were prepared, who boarded up their houses and their businesses, were able to enjoy the benefits of having been prepared. Each one of us should be prepared. And God certainly, more than anyone, helps us to know how to prepare. God himself is the greatest model of being prepared. And he is the one who gives us the best instruction on being prepared. So our question that we're going to answer as we look at this next book, the book of Numbers, is how does God prepare us to serve him? What does the Lord do in our lives to enable us to be able to handle the things that come our way? I mean, God, better than anyone, knows what's coming our way. And if we're able to be prepared by him, then we will be able to handle the various things that come our way in life. The book of Numbers is about preparation to occupy the land. They're not in the land yet, even at the end of the book of Numbers. But God has done everything that Israel needed him to do to really be prepared. And it actually begins around 1445, some would say 1446, when the Exodus took place. And so that's when Numbers actually starts while they're at Mount Sinai, about a year later, because they were at Mount Sinai for about 13 months or so. And they're still at Sinai when Numbers starts. And yet when Numbers ends, we see the nation about 40 years later, from 1444 all the way to about 1405 BC. The book of Numbers takes about 39 years because we have 1 year down at Mount Sinai for the book of Exodus to build the tabernacle and get the priesthoods, robes and tunics and all of these things made. And then Numbers begins after Israel has already made their way out of Goshen down to Sinai. And that's basically the geographical start of Numbers. But we're going to see that they end up far from there. The geographical end of Numbers is to see them go on up to Kadesh Barnea, and they end up having 39 more years of wilderness wanderings, and the book ends while they're standing at Moab, just across from Israel, the land of Israel. And what we see in this book is preparation to occupy the land. God does everything we would expect an organized, holy God to do to prepare his people to receive their inheritance. And I outline the book, as many do, preparing the old generation in chapters 1 to 10:10. But then the center part is the larger part. That going into the land is actually postponed because of their unbelief. In chapter 10:11 to 25:18. And the book finishes with the old generation having died out, and God is preparing the new generation in the final 11 chapters of 26 to 36. So that's our basic flow as we go on through the book of Numbers. We've had kind of a two-section division of the books in Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus. Now we get in Numbers. I'm going to divide the book into 3. So what is our key word for Numbers? It is the word preparation. Preparation. We have gone from election in Genesis to what was Exodus? Formation. And what was Leviticus? Sanctification. And now we are in preparation. Not every one of these books are going to end with shun, okay? I'm going to shun the shun, all right? But we find that there's a lot of good teaching in the book of Numbers. 1 Corinthians 10 is referring back to the water from the rock incident in Numbers. Numbers gives wisdom. In fact, 2 Timothy 3:15 says, Paul says to Timothy, from infancy you've known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation through faith in Christ Jesus. And that's certainly true of the book of Numbers. We can learn a lot from this. As Romans 15:4 says, for everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through endurance and the encouragement of the Scriptures, we might have hope. What God is actually doing in these first 4 books that we're looking at together is He's birthing a people. He's choosing a people, and He's making them His own people. And there are some wonderful parallels, actually, to what God does for us. As we go from Exodus to Leviticus to Numbers, we see for them formation. God was forming a people in Exodus. Just being formed into the people of God who had freedom from Egypt in Exodus 1 to 18, and then a charter, a government, a law in Exodus 19 to 40. That's not sufficient. They needed to also be a holy, sanctified people. Thus we have the book of Leviticus. And being sanctified is not sufficient because they were not in the land yet. And so God, in the book of Numbers, prepares them to actually go on into the land. Do you see the parallels between Israel and actually what God does for us? Exodus is a picture of salvation. God formed them by redeeming them from Egypt. God forms us by redeeming us from sin. You know? Leviticus, that sanctification is really also includes instruction. I mean, honestly, how can you be sanctified unless you know what God wants you to do? And so a great portion of Leviticus, we saw in Leviticus 11 to 27, is instruction in holy living, to live a life that's set apart from pagans, as well as the first 10 chapters that talk about sacrifice and how important that is. Likewise for us, Christians need to be taught. And I'm glad you're taking this study seriously, because these books are foundational for us as believers. And as Numbers talks about the people being prepared for their inheritance, finally getting into the land, so the Lord does the same for us. He prepares us in our walk with Him, because our best life is yet ahead in the future. Our life of inheriting all that God has for us is fantastic. And God wants to prepare us for that. And I think we can learn in the book of Numbers better how to do that. I'll skip Deuteronomy for right now, but looking beyond Numbers to Deuteronomy, you'll see that the people actually are involved in the occupation of the land. And we'll get there soon enough. And that is where they finally get their rest. At least to a limited extent, they have rest from their enemies. They have rest from their wilderness travels. And likewise, that's what the Lord will do for us. After this walk with the Lord, He is leading us to rest. We work hard now, and I trust that you're working hard in serving the Lord Jesus with an eye to the future, realizing that the Lord is going to grant you rest. I summarize the book of Numbers this way. God's faithful preparation of His people to enter Canaan. That's what we have here. Contrast with Israel's unbelieving rebelliousness in the wilderness. To teach the nation His unconditional commitment to fulfill His Abrahamic covenant. Do you see the key phrases there? God is faithful to prepare the people, but the people are unbelieving and rebellious. Nevertheless, God is faithful to the Abrahamic covenant that says that he is going to promise them a land and a seed and a blessing, and he's going to fulfill it. And no person is going to stand in the way of God fulfilling his sovereign purposes. So what we're going to see in this book actually is this, by the way, I don't have page 41 here, but I think page 41 will give you this summary statement. You'll find it on page 135 as well. So here's the question. How does God prepare us to serve him? How does he do it? I think every one of us will recognize that the Lord does do it. And he's faithful to do that in your life. You and I fail not because the Lord didn't prepare us well. We fail because of our own stubbornness. We're going to look at 3 ways in the book that the Lord does that. Here's the first way. God organizes us to be holy. That's how he prepares us. One way. God is an organized God. He's an orderly God working for our purity. He had called Israel to be a holy nation, and he organized them so that they could be such. We see this right from the beginning in Numbers 1. The organization of the people takes 4 chapters because they need to know actually where to live, how to march, how to go through the wilderness, so they're not just one mob making their way through the desert. And so in Numbers 2, the Lord has them make a census. Therefore, we get the name of this book, Numbers. God numbers the people. And we find that the various tribes of Israel are from anywhere from the smallest of, Levites would be 22,000, all the way up to the largest of them all, Judah, that has about 74,000. There's also going to be another numbering of the people at the end. So the 603,000 that we find at the beginning of these 40 years actually ends up being about the same, a little bit less than that. We have a lot of people, 600,000 men of military age is going to bring us with wives and children to probably about 2 million people at least. And we do know that at Sinai, the plain of Rapha to the north of Sinai was large enough for about 2 million people to encamp. And yet they didn't know where they're supposed to camp. And so the Lord told them in Numbers 2 where each of the 12 tribes should encamp. And some have pointed out that actually you've got the largest numbers of people, about 186,000, to the east. And you'll remember that the tabernacle actually faced east. And if you put it into the numbers of people, you actually have about equal numbers of people on the north and the south, around 150,000, smaller to the west, and it actually forms a cross. I don't know if that's just circumstantial or God is saying this is what he wants to do to show in a kind of a pictorial way of actually what the Lord is doing here. Of course, the priests and the Levites, they also need to know where they are to live. And God put them, understandably so, around the tabernacle. These lines, this line of Levi that goes on through, we talked about this last time. The line of Kohath was actually the line that gave Aaron and the priesthood from there. Eleazar, the son of Aaron, ends up becoming the high priest. But they needed to know where they were supposed to go. So you put it all together, you have the priests and the Levites actually living close to the tabernacle, which, frankly, friends, that's the way it's supposed to be. Those who are spiritual leaders of God's people ought to be the closest to him, don't you think? And many of us here are spiritual leaders, and God is expecting us to demonstrate that forth, to be setting an example for the people who are farther away. In any case, that's how the Lord set it up. He's a very organized God. If you're organized, you're following the Lord. Now, you can be overly organized, I guess, where you're just totally obsessive about these things. But God was organized with a purpose. And then he also wanted them to be sanctified, though, as well. So we see laws of sanctification in chapters 5 and 6. In fact, chapter 6 is where we really do see God's blessing in the priestly blessing that the Lord commanded the priest to give to the people. Numbers 6, 24 to 26. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift his countenance upon you and give you peace. That was the blessing that the priests were to give to the people. And the people responded. They knew that God had set this order up, and so it was time for them to come and give their offerings so that the whole tabernacle system could be enacted. And so we see that the various tribes in number 7, each tribe gives actually identical gifts. Very generous gifts, but each of them were identical, showing the unity among the various tribes where they're not trying to outdo one another. And in through chapter 8 and chapter 9, as I look at these, the question comes to me about whether we are really willing to follow God's directions. I mean, you can look at these chapters and say, wow, look how specific you were, God. Why are you so perfectionistic about such things? And yet, honestly, if we really love the Lord, we're going to want to know his directions, and we're going to follow them as closely as they can. Is this you? I mean, are you just one disorganized person who cannot be very reliable? Disorganized people cannot be relied upon. And God was organized, and I believe the Lord wants us to be organized. And God has given you, and he's given me, everything we need to serve him. Everything. So let God work through you, as Philippians 2:13 says, for God is working in you, giving you the desire and the power to do what pleases him. We see in 1 Corinthians 10:13 that God has provided all that we need, and none of us ever get tempted above that which we are able. He says he will not allow the temptation to be more than you can stand. No Christian is ever so tempted that he or she has to sin. That's because God has prepared life for us. He's instructed us. So like Paul, we can say, I can do everything through him who gives me strength. And what a wonderful truth that we can grasp. The same organized God of the book of Numbers is the same organized God in your life and my life. And so if you're not an organized person, I would encourage you to let God work in your life in that way so that you can be more organized, not just for the sake of organization, but so that you can be more reliable and faithful to the Lord. So how does God prepare us to serve him? Well, first of all, he organizes us to be holy. We see this in these first few chapters. But he also is very honest with us in warning us as well. God warns us of the cost of unbelief. That's another way that the Lord prepares us. The Lord disciplines us with a loss of reward when we are believers who refuse to continue believing. And this is the sad center part of the book of Numbers. He's preparing them to occupy the land, but there's also a negative part that counterbalances the organization of God in the first part, and that is the disciplinary hand of God in the middle part. He's given them the silver trumpets that sound to send the people out. He's giving them the marching orders. So all the tribes set on out in this middle section, beginning in chapter 10, verse 11. And the marching line has all the various tribes and the furniture and the tabernacle and the ark of God leading the way. And so they leave the wilderness of Paran and they make their way north from Mount Sinai. But what's the first thing they do? Chapter 11. Soon the people began to complain about their hardship, and the Lord heard everything they said. And then the Lord's anger blazed against them, and he sent a fire to rage among them, and he destroyed some of the people in the outskirts of the camp. And then the people screamed to Moses for help, and when he prayed to the Lord, the fire stopped. And after that, the place was known as Taberah, which means the place of burning, because fire from the Lord had burned among them there. Here we see the beginning. Even though they have all of this preparation and all these blessings of God, They start on out and they're complaining. Do you have a theology of complaining that sustains you? Sometimes we think complaining is a gift. One lady came to D.L. Moody once years ago, and she said, "I think I found my gift." And he said, "Well, what is it?" And she said, "It's complaining." And he said, "I don't think the Lord will mind if you bury that gift." The same thing could be said of the book of Numbers, that time and time again the people are complaining. So the route of the journey goes north, and they're right at the edge of the land at Kadesh, or Kadesh Barnea. And we find in chapter 13, there at Kadesh, they make this decision to, they want to get out of the Sinai. They want to get out of the desert area. But they're not quite ready to just go right into the land. At least they're not ready to trust the Lord to approach the land from the south. So there at Kadesh Barnea, they send spies. They pick a man from each one of the 12 tribes, and the spies leave there and they go northward all the way through the land, almost up to the Euphrates River, way past the modern borders of Israel. And they come back. And wow, do they have the fruit of the land. They carry this huge thing of grapes, so big it took 2 men to carry it. And the report they give, well, at least there was a majority report. They say the land is good, but there's giants in the land. And we feel like grasshoppers in our own sight. You can see it at the end of the book of Numbers. The land we explored is fantastic, they're basically saying. But they said here in verse 33, the people are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. These are giants of ancient days. We seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we look the same to them. That phrase always gets me. We look the same to them. Now, you've got to remember, these guys are spies. Now, can you imagine the spies have gone through. They're looking around the land. And indeed, the people are huge. And they felt small. Do you think they actually interviewed any of those giants? Hey, I kind of feel small. What do you think? Do I kind of look like a grasshopper? Yeah, you look like a grasshopper. They're saying, we look like grasshoppers to them, as if they're representing, some statistical study there of these giants. They're actually projecting their own fears upon these giants. Of course, Joshua and Caleb were not part of the majority report. The G stands for God. For Joshua and Caleb, and they said, verse 30, we should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it. Why could they do it? Because God was with them. Well, unfortunately, in Numbers 14, trip is canceled. At least it's postponed, and postponed a long time. In fact, the 10 who were unwilling to go into the land died that very day. Only Joshua and Caleb went to bed that night. And only Joshua and Caleb were promised that they would actually enter the land. Every single person of these 2 million who were over age 20, which God considered the age of accountability, every one of them over age 20 was said to die in the land. And so God's report is basically our key verse, one of our key verses for the book. God's discipline is in Numbers 14, 22 to 23. God said, not one of the men who saw my glory and miraculous signs I performed in Egypt and in the desert, but who disobeyed me these 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their forefathers. Okay, now, what's actually happening here? Did these people lose their salvation? Did they lose their salvation? No. they lost the blessing of inheriting the land. They were believers in the true God because they put the blood on the doorposts of their houses in Egypt, and they were redeemed out of Egypt. We have a redeemed nation. But they were unwilling to trust God to give them the inheritance that God had promised. Not for everyone, but only for those who were believing and continued in belief and faithfulness. So, the wilderness of Zin was their home for the next 39 years, and the wilderness of Zin was the place of their death. Someone has calculated, 224 funerals a day that they had, something like that. It's over 200 funerals a day. And what a sad picture here. They knew the way. The cartoonist says, after 39 and a half years of wandering in the desert, Mrs. Moses secretly asked for directions. They actually knew the way. The way was the way of obedience. In fact, I believe it was God's will to bring them up from Kadesh and conquer the land from the south. But they're unwilling to do it. And so what we have here is actually divine discipline. They spent the rest of their lives looking at rock formations. They spend the rest of their lives. The most exciting thing they could see was maybe a pleasant sunset. And they were able to have some of the blessings of God. The manna continued. The water continued. But, in fact, their sandals never wore out. And yet, they were still under divine discipline. What we actually see happening here is Old Testament discipline that Numbers 15 highlights for us pretty well. Here's the picture, okay? Death came to defiant believers in the Old Testament. So discipline, at least this severe, would come to rejecting the Christ that we know today. This is a severe message I'm bringing, but I believe it's true. The man who picked up sticks in direct violation to God saying, the Sabbath is holy, you are not to work on the Sabbath, was actually a picture of capital crimes here for Jewish believers who sinned unintentionally. In this case, this man was not one who sinned unintentionally. He was directly, defiantly, intentionally sinning against God. And this is death for a capital crime. Numbers is actually being referred to in Hebrews 10. For anyone who refused to obey the law of Moses was put to death without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. There was the death penalty. And we have, as Joseph Dillow says in his book, the future reign of the servant kings. That's the subtitle, actually, of the book Final Destiny. He depicts a way to put this together that I have found very helpful. And he calls this view the partaker's view, or the participation view, the inheritance view. And I find this teaching very convincing about inheritance in the Old Testament. And here's what Dr. Jody Dillow says in terms of inheritance in the Old Testament. A difference exists between inheriting the land of Canaan and living there. The former, that's inheriting the land, refers to ownership, and the latter refers to mere residence. Okay? They're both 2 different types of inheritance. While Israel was promised the inheritance as a nation, the condition for maintaining their inheritance right into the land of Canaan was faith, obedience, and completion of one's task. The promise, while national, was applied only to the believing and obedient remnant. The inheritance is not to be equated with heaven, but with something in addition to heaven, promised to those believers who faithfully obey the Lord. Just as the Old Testament believers forfeited their earthly inheritance through disobedience, we can also forfeit our future reward or our inheritance by a similar failure. Loss of inheritance, however, does not mean loss of salvation. Two kinds of inheritance were enjoyed in the Old Testament. All the Israelites who had believed and were therefore regenerate had God as their inheritance. But not all inherited the land. This paves the way for the concept that the New Testament also may teach two inheritances. We're all heirs of God, but we're not all joint heirs with Christ unless we persevere to the end of life. The former, that's being an heir of God, refers to our salvation, and the latter refers to our reward. As a child of God who was both an heir of God and an heir of Canaan by virtue of faith in God, that resulted in regeneration. And yet only those believers in Israel who were faithful would maintain their status as firstborn sons, who would actually receive what had been promised to them as an inheritance. You get the idea? Two types of inheritance. And the same thing is actually taught in the New Testament. We have two types of inheritance actually taught in Romans 8:17, which says, now, if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God, and co-heirs with Christ, if indeed we share in his sufferings in order that we may also share in his glory. Do you notice Paul says here? There's two types of inheritance. Being heirs of God, and there's no qualifier there, but being co-heirs with Christ has the if statement following it. In other words, we are heirs of God because all who trust in Jesus Christ by faith alone receive salvation. But not everybody is going to be rewarded. Only those who share in his sufferings are considered to be co-heirs with Christ. Might be a new concept for you. It certainly was for me. But I think there's biblical warrant in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. I'll come back to that later. So, Israel is left in the wilderness. And in that wilderness, we see much failure on Israel's part. Korah leads a rebellion in Numbers 16, so much so that the ground opens up and he and his followers all get swallowed up by the ground. They did not lose their salvation, okay? They lost their reward. They lost their inheritance. They lost their privilege of being able to be in the land of Canaan. There's more complaining in Numbers 16:35. Then fire blazed forth from the Lord and burned up the 250 men who were offering incense. These who said, how come Aaron's the priesthood? We all are priests. These are Levites. They would not stay with their responsibility and blessing with God. These Levites wanted to be priests. I see grumbling all over the book of Numbers. And it kind of raises a question, is grumbling okay? It sure doesn't seem like grumbling's okay in the book of Numbers, does it? But then we're going to look later on to Psalms. And, you've got these lament psalms, complaint psalms that we'll see later on. Is God okay with that? Is God okay with grumbling? Let's hold on to that, and we'll deal with that in Psalms. So it took Moses 40 years to lead the people out of the wilderness. And it wasn't because the line was long at the ladies' bathroom, but it was because of the people's sin. It was because the people refused to believe in the Lord. It's because the people continued to grumble in the wilderness. Paul Ben Ware, in his book, Survey of the Old Testament, lists out the many complaints that they had, Moses' response, and God's response. And you'll see that most of the time it was judgment, judgment, judgment from God. God's not really thrilled about complaining. So if that's your gift, God is very happy for you to bury it. All right? When we get to number 17, we see actually what 1 Corinthians is looking back on, where he talks about believers who so sin against the Lord, in this case in 1 Corinthians 11, they so sin against God, and they eat and drink the body of the Lord, they drink judgment on themselves. And that's why 1 Corinthians 11:30 says, that is why many among you are weak and sick, and a number of you have fallen asleep. Are these people who lost their salvation? Not at all. These are Corinthians who so sinned against God in the Lord's Supper that the Lord took their lives prematurely. They didn't go to hell. They went to heaven sooner than they should have, because they were more useful to the Lord in heaven than they were on earth. They'd lost their usefulness on earth. And as we go through Numbers 18 and 19, we see how God is working in all of this. He's doing all that he should do. There's details about the red heifer, the perfect holy cow, you might say, for purification. And these cows, this cow is commanded of God to purify the people. When we get to Numbers 20, we see that finally they're on their way to Moab. They're getting out of the wilderness and they're making their way around to the east. And God graciously provides water from the rock. Wonderfully. Moses, initially had only to speak to a rock to provide water for the people. In this particular case, God says to tell them to speak to the rock, and it will pour out water from the rock. And Numbers 20 says, Moses took his staff from the Lord's presence, verse 9, and he and Aaron gathered the people together, and they said, you listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock? And then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff, and water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. But was God pleased? The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you didn't trust me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them. Now, if you think that you and I can not be faithful to the Lord and get our inheritance when God denied the inheritance to Moses himself, I think you and I have too high a view of ourselves. I certainly would never think that I have a closer relationship with the Lord than Moses. And yet if God will deny the inheritance to Moses and to Aaron, the two key leaders, he will do it to any believer who so dishonors him that God will actually take their lives. I know stories of such people, and perhaps you do as well. This is a good warning for all of us. And so as they go on in and they wander around, they didn't enter at Kadesh. They wandered for 39 more years, and they finally made their way up toward Moab, and they passed by Mount Hor. And it was here the people grew impatient with the Lord, and they complained about the manna, just as believers today often complain about God's blessings. And God sent poisonous snakes among them. In fact, the snakes killed some of the people. And so God said, make a bronze snake and have it be available up so that people can look at it and they'll be healed from their snake bites. This bronze serpent, or the bronze snake, is actually doubled up in the symbol of the American Medical Association that draws its imagery from Numbers 21 and seeks to be a source of healing for the people. It's also, this bronze serpent is referred to in John 13, where Jesus said, and as Moses lifted up the bronze snake on a pole in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. Just as Israel found healing and looking up at that bronze snake, so we find healing from sin by looking up at Jesus. And interestingly, that snake on a pole may have very well been in the form of a cross, so that the snake would actually be able to stay on the pole. Well, the Lord brought them farther north, and the Arnon Gorge separated Moab from the land north of it. It is a huge gorge. This is a picture from one side looking north, and when you get to the north and you look south, it looks basically about the same. This gorge is gorgeous. That's just a joke. All right. It's actually quite plain. and it empties on into the Dead Sea. And that is a natural border between Moab and the nations that were north of it. Nations really of the kingdom of Sihon in the south and Og in the north. And Numbers 21 talks about how the people had victory over Sihon and how the people had victory over Og. And yet, even though they had that victory, there was a pretty major event that happened in Numbers 22 to 25, where the king, Balak of Moab, even though God was not going to take the land of Moab and give that land to Israel, he felt threatened by having such a huge nation at his border. And so Balak, the king, hired Balaam, the pagan prophet, from far north. And so Balak actually comes on down, and he's hired to curse Israel. But he promises, I'm going to say whatever God tells me to say. And Balaam blesses Israel actually 3 times instead of cursing them. And the blessing stuck. In fact, they had victory over not only Sihon in the south at the city of Jahaz, they had victory over Og in the north. And Balak failed to turn God against Israel. In fact, God even opens the mouth of Balaam's donkey in rebuke, making sure that Balaam was going to follow the Lord. So Balak failed to turn God against Israel. We have this blessing from him instead. And here's where actually we see the second of the key verses. We talked about the discipline, a key verse in Numbers 14. But I think on this one, I want to have 2 key verses for the book of Numbers. Balaam says to Balak in Numbers 23, when Balak says, I want you to change your mind about God, change God's mind, curse these people instead of blessing them. Balaam responds, God's not a man that he should lie, or a son of a man that he should change his mind. Does he speak and then not act? Does he promise and not fulfill? I have received a command to bless. He has blessed, and I cannot change it. And this is a wonderful promise from God, because even though Israel continues to fail and fail and fail in the book of Numbers, God says, you're failing me, but I'm not going to fail you. And Balaam actually, though at the end, he actually turns and ends up becoming a cause for sin to Israel. And so we see passages like 2 Peter 2 referring to Balaam in a negative way. They've left the straight way and wandered off to follow the way of Balaam, son of Beor, who loved the wages of wickedness. But he was rebuked for his wrongdoing by a donkey, a beast without speech, who spoke with a man's voice and restrained the prophet's madness. Why would it say that? Well, because of Numbers 25. Even though Balak failed to turn God against Israel, Balak succeeded to turn Israel against God. Because at the city of Beth Peor, Balaam was, in his greed, instrumental in getting the men of Israel to commit sexual immorality with Moabite and Midianite women. So therefore, reflecting back on this, Jude 11 says, woe to them, they've taken the way of Cain. They have rushed for profit into Balaam's error. They've been destroyed in Korah's rebellion. So Balaam obviously made money off getting the Israelites to fail. And Balak turned Israel against God via the immorality at Beth Peor. And along with that immorality was pagan worship, where they offered, they participated in the worship of the god Moloch. Nevertheless, I have a few things against you, Jesus said in Revelation 2. You have people there who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to entice the Israelites to sin by eating food sacrificed to idols and by committing sexual immorality. You see the reference here? Hold back to the sin of Beth Peor. So likewise, you have those who hold to the teaching of the Nicolaitans. What's God saying here? He's saying God instructs us through the failures of others. Do you look at the failures of others and learn from them? You know, one characteristic of sheep is that sheep will see other sheep do really stupid things, and then they go do the same thing. Just like people. No wonder why the scripture compares us to sheep. I heard one shepherd talk about a sheep that liked the grass on the other side of the barbed wire fence, so the sheep stuck his head through the barbed wire, and start eating the grass on the other side. Of course, got his head stuck and tried to pull it back, and after a while he started getting all bleeding, and the shepherd actually went by there a few hours later. He was wondering where the sheep were, and he saw an entire line of sheep all lined up on the barbed wire fence. All of them with their heads over the other side, eating the grass there, and all of them with bloodied necks. And sheep are about as stupid as people are. Or should I say, people are about as stupid as sheep are. Sometimes marriages fail. So what do? Sometimes grandparents are parents again. Sometimes these things happen. The sin of other people really, really affects us. And we actually have really a depiction here of what we see in salvation. We see in the Old Testament, faith in God is offered, a Passover lamb, meets God's reward of the Exodus. And it's followed by a life of faith, of journey to Canaan. And we actually find a parallel here for us as believers. We have faith in Christ as the Lamb of God, and God's response is to give us salvation. But that life of faith needs to be a life of growth. And so we're really distinguishing between positional sanctification, who we are in Christ, and progressive sanctification, becoming realistically more like Jesus as we go through life. And yet we need restored fellowship with God. So God provided sacrifices in the Old Testament, and he provides confession of sin for us now. We have basically a type and an anti-type depicted here in the book of Numbers. And today, even in our New Testament era, there still is divine discipline. We see it with Ananias and Sapphira, who lied at the early church, and it cost them their lives. We see it in 2 John 8. John told the woman who was taking in false teachers and showing hospitality to them, watch out that you don't lose what you've worked so hard to achieve. Be diligent so that you receive your full reward. And some sin here actually leads to premature death. John refers to this in 1 John 5, verse 16. If anyone sees his brother commit a sin that doesn't lead to death, I think he's talking about physical death, he should pray, and God will give him life. I refer to those whose sin doesn't lead to death. But there is a sin that leads to death, and I'm not saying you should pray about that. All wrongdoing is sin, and there is a sin that does not lead to death. But there are sins that do lead to death, that will take your life and my life. And that's what this nation actually saw happen to them. So how does God prepare us to serve him? We said that we're going to see three ways to do that. He organizes us to be holy. He did that with Israel. He certainly does that with us. He warns us of the cost of unbelief. He certainly warned Israel, and the great majority of them, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb, didn't make their way in the land, including Moses and Aaron didn't make their way into the land. But God also prepares us by rewarding our faithfulness. He promises us that there's a reward for faithfulness. If we continue in faith and obedience, we will truly experience God's blessing with inheritance in the land. So while Leviticus relates to the nation's worship, Numbers relates to the nation's walk. So what we see in this book is God prepared Israel to walk with him in covenantal relationship, but the nation postponed entrance in the land by unbelief in the middle section of the book. And when we get to these last 11 chapters, we see God is faithful to his covenants. And so he prepared a new generation to enter the land. And what we see continually here is the narrative is contrasting God's faithfulness with Israel's faithlessness. So that preparation to occupy the land has to be reenacted, or it has to happen again for a new generation in the last 11 chapters. And we find that the 603,000 warriors is basically the same 20 or 40 years later with about 601,000. They've only lost about 1,800 people. And so the various tribes in Numbers 26 are counted, and they haven't received their inheritance yet, but God wants them to make sure that He knows that He is faithful to provide all they need. He's provided all the soldiers they need to come into the land. And that is proven by a second census. In Numbers 27, we see a review of the offerings. Numbers 28, special offerings are reviewed for the people to make sure that they know what they're doing. And then God talks about the feasts again, similar to what we saw in Leviticus 23. And as they go on through, we see God give them final preparations in Numbers 31. These final preparations is to give Gad and Reuben and the half-tribe of Manasseh their land. And the others are going to get their land in Joshua. But these final preparations settle the Trans-Jordan area to these particular tribes. And yet they are warned they better go on ahead, and they better go with their brothers over on the other side. The borders of Canaan are defined, and then finally in Numbers 34, we see these borders talked about with the background actually of Genesis 15 that I didn't cover when we talked about Genesis. It says, "On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, 'To your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt,'" there we are in the south, "'to the great river, the river Euphrates.'" Here's the land that God actually promised to Abraham's descendants. This land of Israel was a huge land that includes modern-day Lebanon and Syria, which gives us a little bit of insight why Israel has some problems with their neighbors. And the borders of the land are all spelled out very clearly. God is a God who is quite orderly in all these things. And He wants them to know exactly what He has promised for them. 48 cities are promised for the Levites, including 6 cities of refuge for those who had accidentally killed someone, and they were to live there until the death of the high priest. And finally, it ends with, before all the tribal allotments go, we have the various daughters of Zelophehad in the final chapter, where these 5 daughters who have no brothers say, "This is not really fair, is it, that we don't get an inheritance?" And God says, "You can have an inheritance as long as you marry within your tribe." Thus, the book of Numbers ends at Moab, with the people ready to go in the land. Are they ready? You might think so, but Moses feels like he needs to really reiterate some things to them first. Thus, we'll see in the book of Deuteronomy what he tells them. But it's a reminder to us that God will continue leading you when you're obedient. And do you really doubt that God will forget to reward you? Sometimes Christians forget that, and we just go off and do our own thing. And the New Testament tells us about some wonderful 5 crowns that are promised for those who really serve the Lord faithfully. And Jesus said in Revelation 3, "I'm coming soon. Hold on to what you have so no one will take away your crown." So how does God prepare us to serve Him? Well, God's faithful preparation for His people to enter Canaan contrasts with Israel's unbelieving rebelliousness in the wilderness to teach the nation His unconditional commitment to fulfill His Abrahamic covenant. In other words, said simply, God organizes. There's the first third of Numbers. God warns. There's the middle section. And God rewards us to be prepared for service. He organizes us to be holy. He warns us of the cost of unbelief. And He rewards our faithfulness. So we should realize that God has given us everything we need to do His will. But disobedience deserves discipline. And God's going to get His will done either through you or in spite of you. So are you characterized by commitment or by complaining? Be prepared. God's directing you. How is He directing you? How is He warning you right now? How is He saying, go this way? Or how is He saying, don't go that way? What He's telling you is for your good. He's preparing you. And you are smart to follow what He says wholeheartedly.